Imagine being ruined, completely and utterly destroyed in society because you said one wrong word. Not a curse word, not an insult, just an ordinary word that today you'd use without thinking twice. Welcome to the linguistic minefield that was a Victorian lady's life, where your vocabulary could determine whether you'd marry well or die alone in disgrace. I'm about to reveal the shocking words and phrases that no respectable Victorian woman would ever repeat. And trust me, some of these will blow your mind, because what seems innocent to us was absolutely scandalous to them. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why controlling women's language was one of the most powerful tools of oppression in the 19th century. Let's start with something that seems completely harmless. A Victorian lady would never, ever say the word legs. Yes, you heard that right, legs. The word itself was considered so provocative, so dangerously suggestive that it had to be replaced. Instead, a proper lady would say limbs when absolutely necessary. But even better, she'd avoid mentioning that part of the body altogether. This wasn't just about being prim, this was about erasing the female body from conversation entirely. The logic was twisted but crystal clear. If women didn't talk about having legs, then men wouldn't think about what was attached to those legs. The female body had to be invisible, even in language. Piano legs were covered with fabric skirts. Chicken legs became dark meat. The entire Victorian world conspired to pretend that women floated around like ghosts, bodiless and pure. But it gets stranger. A lady couldn't say pregnant. This word was far too explicit, too directly connected to the sexual act that created that condition. Instead, she was in a delicate condition, or in confinement, or expecting. The medical reality of pregnancy was wrapped in so many layers of euphemism that it became almost mystical. Women would disappear from public life for months, their condition never named, never acknowledged directly. Think about the psychological impact of this. You couldn't even name what was happening to your own body. You existed in a state of enforced mystery, where the most natural biological process became unspeakable. This linguistic erasure trained women to be ashamed of their own physical existence. Now let's talk about undergarments, because this is where Victorian anxiety reached truly absurd levels. A proper lady never mentioned underwear or undergarments. These items didn't exist in polite conversation. If she absolutely had to reference them, she'd say linen or unmentionables. Yes, unmentionables. They literally call them things we don't mention because mentioning them was too close to mentioning what they covered. Men's underwear was even more forbidden. A woman could be ostracized for accidentally referencing male underclothes in mixed company. The scandal would follow her for years. Laundry day must have required an entirely separate vocabulary, a secret language of domestic necessity that existed outside the parlor's strict rules. Here's one that reveals the class anxieties lurking beneath Victorian propriety. A lady never said wealthy or rich. These words were considered vulgar, too directly connected to commerce and money. Instead, she'd say someone was comfortable or well-situated or had means. Money was dirty, you see. It came from work, from trade, from the masculine world of business that ladies were supposed to know nothing about. This created a bizarre situation where the ruling class couldn't even acknowledge their own wealth. They had to pretend it simply existed, like air, without source or effort. Meanwhile, poverty was equally unspeakable. The poor were unfortunate or humble. This linguistic gymnastics allowed the wealthy to ignore the economic violence that maintained their position. A Victorian lady absolutely could not say she was bored. Boredom implied that the endless rounds of social calls, needlework, and chaperoned activities weren't fulfilling enough. It suggested dissatisfaction with a woman's proper role. Instead, she might say she felt dull or listless. But even these admissions were risky. A woman was supposed to find infinite joy in her limited sphere. To suggest otherwise was to question the entire social order. This one's particularly insidious. She couldn't say no directly to a man, especially a suitor. A blunt refusal was considered rude, unfeminine, aggressive. Instead, she had to deploy an arsenal of soft refusals. I'm afraid that wouldn't be suitable. Perhaps another time. I must consult my family. Even rejecting an unwanted marriage proposal required elaborate politeness. The man's ego had to be preserved at all costs, even if it meant enduring months of unwanted attention. Think about the power dynamic this created. Women couldn't establish clear boundaries. Every refusal had to be cushioned, softened, made ambiguous enough that the man could pretend he hadn't been rejected at all. This trained women to doubt their own assertiveness and trained men to ignore subtle social cues. Here's one that shows how deeply sexuality was repressed. A lady never said ankle. Yes, ankles. Even this word was too suggestive. If she had to reference this body part, she'd use elaborate circumlocutions. The lower extremity was acceptable in some circles, but truly refined ladies simply avoided the topic entirely. Male obsession with ankles in this era was genuinely bizarre. A glimpse of ankle could spark scandal. Women's dresses swept the floor, partly to ensure that ankles remained hidden. The eroticism projected onto this most innocent body part reveals how starved Victorian culture was for any acknowledgement of physical reality. When you forbid everything, anything becomes forbidden fruit. A proper Victorian lady never admitted to sweating. Ladies didn't sweat. They perspired if absolutely necessary, but preferably they glowed or simply remained mysteriously cool despite their corsets, layers of petticoats, and floor-length dresses in summer heat. The physical realities of having a body were systematically denied. This connects to a larger pattern. Women weren't supposed to have bodily functions at all. They didn't eat heartily, they didn't exercise vigorously, they certainly didn't discuss digestion or elimination. The ideal woman was practically ethereal, sustained by delicate morsels and pure thoughts. Any reminder that women were human animals was deeply threatening to Victorian gender ideology. She couldn't say naked or nude. These words were shockingly explicit. Instead, art featured unclothed figures or classical subjects in a state of nature. Museums covered statues' genitals with fig leaves. Even paintings of cherubs required carefully positioned clouds. The human body had to be completely hidden or transformed into bloodless classical marble. This prudery created genuine problems. How do you discuss art history? How do you teach anatomy? How do you explain mythology? Victorian culture tied itself in knots trying to acknowledge classical civilization while pretending that ancient Greeks and Romans were as prudish as 19th century Britons. A lady never said she was exhausted or tired. This implied weakness, an inability to fulfill her duties with cheerful submission. Instead, she might admit to feeling fatigued in the most delicate way possible, but even this was risky. Women were supposed to possess infinite patience and energy for domestic tasks, no matter how grueling or repetitive. The reality, of course, was that Victorian women were often genuinely exhausted. Corsets restricted breathing, heavy clothing was physically burdensome, multiple pregnancies took a toll. But admitting to physical limits was admitting that the idealized version of womanhood was impossible. So women suffered in silence, medicating with laudanum, developing mysterious nervous conditions, and dying young. Here's the surprising one. She couldn't say obey. Wait, what? But wasn't obedience the whole point? Yes, but saying it directly was too crude. The word appeared in marriage vows, but in daily conversation, a lady would instead talk about yielding to her husband's judgment or deferring to his wisdom. Obedience had to be framed as a choice, a gracious decision, not a requirement. This linguistic sleight of hand concealed the very real lack of rights women faced. They couldn't vote, couldn't own property in many cases, couldn't divorce abusive husbands. But by avoiding the word obey, Victorian culture pretended this was all voluntary, a natural expression of feminine delicacy rather than legal subjugation. A Victorian lady never said stomach. This word was far too associated with digestion, with the animal processes of eating and elimination. Instead, she had a bosom that might feel unsettled. Yes, they used bosom for the entire torso. Stomach aches were nervous complaints or delicate constitutions. The digestive system existed in a fog of euphemisms. This reached absurd heights at meals. Ladies weren't supposed to have hearty appetites. They picked at food delicately, never admitting to hunger. Cookbooks from the era give advice on foods that won't cause distress to ladies' sensitive systems. The message was clear. Even basic biological needs were somehow unladylike. She absolutely could not use slang. Any colloquial expression, any informal language marked a woman as lower class. Even mildly casual speech could ruin a reputation. Ain't was social death. Regional dialects had to be suppressed. The goal was a crystalline, formal English that bore no marks of individuality or regional identity. This created an artificial, stilted way of speaking that makes Victorian dialogue in old books seem impossibly formal to modern ears. But it also created rigid class boundaries. You could instantly identify someone's social position by their vocabulary. Language became a tool of exclusion, a way to keep social climbers in their place. A proper lady never contradicted a man directly. Even if he was objectively wrong, she couldn't say, "That's incorrect," or "I disagree." Instead, she had to use elaborate softening. "Might it be possible that?" Or "I wonder if perhaps," or some authorities suggest. Her knowledge had to be presented tentatively, as if she were unsure, even when she was absolutely certain. This trained women to doubt their own intelligence and expertise. It also meant that women's knowledge was constantly erased from public discourse. A woman could be an expert on a subject, but her insights would be dismissed if she presented them too confidently. Male mediocrity was accepted. Female brilliance had to disguise itself as uncertainty. Here's one that cuts deep. A Victorian lady never said she was angry. Anger was a masculine emotion, aggressive and unfeminine. Instead, she was disappointed or distressed or concerned. Even righteous fury had to be repackaged as wounded delicacy. A woman couldn't express rage at injustice without being labeled hysterical. This emotional policing was incredibly damaging. Women had plenty to be angry about: lack of rights, domestic violence, economic dependence, forced pregnancies. But they couldn't name their anger without social penalty. This forced suppression of legitimate rage contributed to the epidemic of nervous disorders among Victorian women. When you can't express emotion, it doesn't disappear, it turns inward. A lady never used medical terms. Diseases had polite euphemisms. Cancer was a growth or a complaint. Syphilis was a social disease, if mentioned at all. Mental illness was nervous exhaustion or brain fever. This made it nearly impossible to discuss health issues seriously. Women couldn't advocate for their own medical care when they couldn't even name their conditions. This medical prudery killed people. Patients couldn't describe symptoms accurately. Doctors couldn't explain treatments. Preventable diseases spread because nobody could discuss them frankly. The conspiracy of silence around illness served neither health nor morality. She couldn't say boyfriend or any equivalent. Courtship had to be discussed in the most formal terms. He was a suitor or a gentleman caller. The relationship was an understanding or an attachment. Any suggestion of romance or, heaven forbid, physical attraction was scandalous. Women were supposed to drift into marriage like sleepwalkers, motivated by nothing so crass as desire or choice. This denial of female desire had profound consequences. Women entered marriages with no understanding of sex. Many genuinely didn't know what would happen on their wedding night. The result was often trauma, both physical and psychological. But discussing any of this was impossible because the vocabulary didn't exist in polite society. A Victorian lady never said anything was cheap. This word was vulgar, too connected to commerce. She'd say something was economical or a good value if she absolutely had to discuss price. But ideally, she pretended money didn't exist at all. Ladies shopped, but they didn't haggle. They acquired things, but they didn't buy them. This pretense created real problems for women managing households on limited budgets. They were responsible for domestic economy, but couldn't discuss it openly. Shopping became a guilty secret, something done with whispers and discretion. The working-class reality of most families was hidden behind a facade of genteel comfort. Here's a particularly cruel one. A lady never said she was clever. Intelligence in women was suspect, threatening. If praised for cleverness, she had to deflect. "Oh, it was nothing. Anyone could have done it. I merely followed instructions." Female achievement had to be minimized, rendered accidental, presented as the result. A proper Victorian lady never mentioned divorce. This word was scandalous even when discussing other people. Marriages were permanent, no matter how abusive or miserable. If absolutely necessary to reference a divorced person, she'd say they were separated or living apart. The finality of divorce couldn't be acknowledged. This taboo trapped women in dangerous situations. Domestic violence was epidemic, but women had no recourse. They couldn't leave, couldn't discuss their situations, couldn't seek help without scandal. The conspiracy of silence around divorce protected abusers and condemned victims to lifelong suffering. She couldn't say ambitious. Ambition in women was seen as grasping, unfeminine, threatening to men. A woman could want things, but she had to present these desires as service to others. She didn't want education for herself, she wanted to be a better mother. She didn't want independence, she wanted to help her family. Female desire had to be filtered through selflessness. This is still with us, by the way. Women are still punished for appearing too ambitious, too aggressive in pursuing goals. The Victorian lady whispering carefully about her hopes is not so different from the modern woman downplaying her achievements to avoid seeming threatening. A lady never said anything tasted bad. Food was unusual, or not to my taste, or quite distinctive. Direct criticism was rude. This extended beyond food to everything. Women couldn't express strong negative opinions without being labeled difficult or hysterical. They existed in a permanent. The Victorian lady's forbidden words may be different from ours, but the impulse to control women's language, and through it, women's power, remains alive and well. Every time a woman is told she's too loud, too quiet, too angry, too emotional, too cold, we're seeing echoes of those drawing rooms where ladies whispered carefully, monitoring every syllable. So the next time you speak your mind directly, use a word without softening it, express anger without apologizing, or simply say no clearly and firmly, remember, you're doing something Victorian ladies couldn't do. You're exercising a freedom they were denied. Your unfiltered vocabulary is a form of power they never had. Language is freedom. The words you're allowed to use define the life you're allowed to live. Those Victorian ladies knew this, even if they couldn't say it aloud. They passed down their forbidden words, their secret languages, their coded communications. They found ways to speak truth in a world that demanded silence. And now you know their secrets. You know what they couldn't say and why it mattered. You understand that controlling women's language was never about politeness or propriety. It was about power, pure and simple. It always has been.